Hey, welcome to session 5 on leadership, especially as it related to the church. And we'll talk today about a leader and their family, as well as kind of the leader and their relationship with the church. If you haven't noticed, the whole thing that we're really talking about is relationships. You know, if you don't have good relationships, you're not going to have good ministry. All of ministry really is relationally based, and we see that certainly in the ministry of Jesus. But let me just share a few things on this. Like, you know, first of all, the relationships that are important starts with the call. We talked about that last time. You got to make sure you're really called of God. There could be nothing more miserable than to try and be a leader in church and in church life and not be called to it, because, you know, sheep bite and all of that. So, you know, it's important to recognize that hey, you know, the congregation's important and your call is to bless people, but, you know, your first congregation, if you will, is your family. Now, if you're single, then your focus can be more on the ministry of the church, but you got to be careful. I mean, single pastors, single leaders, normally what they end up having is a church of about 70% women, half of which believe that they've been called of God to marry the single pastor. So anyway, you got to be careful with that. But, you know, keeping your heart pure, keeping your life pure is all very important for all of us. If you're going to get married, which is highly recommended, even by God, I mean, make sure the choice that you make. So a lot of times, you know, people come to ministry later in life, and so you kind of already have your wife, and so you got to make the best of it. But if nothing else, you want to make sure you're on the same page. I mean, you know, in other words, you better know that your spouse is in agreement with you being in the ministry, because ministry is demanding, just like any profession, but even more so because most spiritual leaders are on call 24/7. I mean, you cannot, you know, not be there, as it were. But you can set healthy boundaries. We'll talk about that as we go. But if you're going to select a spouse, make sure, if possible, number one, be helpful if they're a believer. Yeah. Number two, that they're mature, that they love you, that you love them, and that they're clearly in agreement with this call. Now, you know, when I got married to Karen, a beautiful young bride, and, you know, I told her before we got married that I have a call of God on my life, and she just nodded because she was in love with the reflection of herself in my eyes or whatever. You know, the fact is she had no clue what the ministry was going to do and how it was going to function. I didn't really either. But fortunately, we were, I guess, young enough, naive enough, and in love enough, and in love with the Lord enough that we were able to work out the dance steps fairly well together. But ministry creates great pressure on families, and so you got to be careful about, again, the choice you make. So his or her character should be sound, and they should have their own spiritual relationship. I mean, I know a lot of pastors will say, you know, I'm not just your husband, but I'm also your pastor. You know, good luck with that. Your husband, your wife, that's your primary role inside your house, not being the spiritual leader of a congregation. No, you're going to love each other, care for each other, but you got to work out the dance steps together. I mean, you know, there's a whole lot of teaching I've done in the past on marriage and family, and one of the things I talk about a lot is power, and who's got the power in the family, who wears the pants. And as I've said many times, if everything's going well, neither one of you are wearing the pants. You're having a good time. You're enjoying life together, because inside the home is a sacred space, and it needs to be made sacred. You need to have healthy boundaries. So there should be special time for family that the congregation is not invited to. They're not a part of. Your kids need to know, if you have kids, that they're special. Not better than anybody else, but special. And that you want to protect them. You don't want to raise them in a bubble if at all possible. That's why when I had the choice, I actually lived far enough away from where I was serving a congregation that I was able to, you know, have that private time. We had our separate life. I wasn't worried about, if I went to a movie with my kids, whether someone was going to be judging the choice of the movie. All that nonsense. Anyway, these are decisions you have to make. At all times, husband and wife, honor your spouse. Speak well of them, especially in public. Resist every urge to bring shame and reproach upon your spouse. I mean, it's easy to do sometimes, especially if you tend to be a more passive-aggressive individual, to bring up some of the faults and failures and foibles of a spouse, and you got to resist that. Because people hear it, and I remember one time my bride, she was talking to elders in the church, and she and I had had a disagreement about something, and so she was not feeling very good toward me, and she shared that with this couple. And they came unraveled. They thought they had to reside the church because the whole church was falling apart because we were getting divorced. And we looked at each other and said, you know, homicide we've thought about, and suicide could be an option, but divorce? I mean, that's just not even in our vocabulary. But so you got to be careful about what you say, especially publicly about your spouse. And again, as a husband, as a wife, whatever your role is in leadership, you want to take care of your family to the best of your ability. That includes financial security. And if you say, well, my church just doesn't pay me enough, well, if you have to, I guess maybe you need to get a second job. And you got to do what you got to do to take care of your family. Because as a spiritual leader, your first and foremost responsibility is yourself and your relationship between you and the Lord, and secondly, your family. And if you mess that up, no matter how good you do in terms of taking care of a congregation or leading a ministry, it just isn't worth it to make a family suffer for the success of the church or the kingdom of God. Hey, we're going to continue on in the next one. We're going to talk about the relationship between a spiritual leader and their church. We'll go over that one in just the next session.